When most people talk about westerns now, they tend to only go back as far as the 90s. I'm thinking of movies like Tombstone, Unforgiven, or Dances with Wolves. For me, and if you've watched my channel before you'll know this, I like to go back a little further, or a lot further. But even with how much I love westerns, there's no denying that the genre started to decline in the 1960s, and by the 70s it was pretty much down to the Duke, John Wayne, to keep the classic western alive, up until his final film in 1976. Between the 1970s and the 90s, there lies a decade in which the western was the least prolific genre since westerns and movies began, the 1980s. Out of the relatively sparse list of westerns made during that decade, especially ones that are still remembered today, I think there is a clear winner for the greatest one of the bunch. It was released right smack dab in the middle, 1985, and it is, of course, Silverado, written and directed by Lawrence Kasdan. After writing a few little movies like The Empire Strikes Back and Raiders of the Lost Ark, Lawrence Kasdan decided it was his turn to sit in the director's chair. He directed a couple of films before delivering a love letter to the classic western. Again, I'm talking about Silverado. Silverado is, to put it most simply, one of the most fun westerns ever made. The cast, the direction, the action scenes, the music, all of it is excellent, and it blends together into this joyous experience. There are plenty of darker, more serious, mournful tales of the Old West that had come before and continue to be released. Those have their place, but Silverado is elevated above so many other films because of its rewatchability. Like Rio Bravo, which I reviewed a little while back, it's a movie that I've revisited so many times throughout my life. Unlike Rio Bravo, I'm not going to call Silverado perfect. There are a lot of characters, and not all of them are entirely necessary, or perhaps used that well. And the bad guy's motivations are a little thin. But in the end, those things don't matter, because the audience is swept along on this adventure filled with action and comedy. And comedy that really works. Unlike the quippy, in-joke filled scripts and movies of today, I think every moment that is designed to get a laugh in Silverado gets one, each and every time. And it's meant to be nostalgic. Lawrence Kasdan fills the movie with every element you would have if you consulted a checklist of Western movie essentials. Stunning vistas, a cattle stampede, a saloon brawl, a wagon train, horse chases, and gunfights in the street. The plot can be boiled down to this. 4 men are brought together and quickly form a bond of friendship forged through acts of heroism. Some bad guys are preying on innocent people, and these 4 friends set out to stop them. And while there is a lot going on in the story, at the same time it's very simple, and can be enjoyed on that level. Like I said, there are a lot of characters, but the quartet of protagonists is the main draw here. The performances of Scott Glenn, Kevin Kline, Danny Glover, and Kevin Costner are all incredible, and share such wonderful chemistry, and besides them, Brian Dennehy and Linda Hunt are both fantastic as well. Our 4 heroes all represent different archetypes that have been seen in westerns before. Each of these characters could lead their own story, and Lawrence Kasdan does a great job of balancing their personalities and making sure that each of them have their moments to shine. In Scott Glenn's Emmett, you have the quiet gunman with a past. Scott Glenn hasn't had that many opportunities to play a lead like this, and especially as he's aged, has transitioned into more character parts. But here, he's perfect, playing a stalwart loner, but not a loner for very long. With Kevin Kline as Payton, you've got the low-key former outlaw who needs to decide what shape his life is to take in the future. He's always got a twinkle in his eye, and if this is the only western that Kevin Kline ever makes, and so far it has been, he was well cast. Yep, this is the only western. In Danny Glover's Mal, you've got the noble man who's been pushed too far and just wants to live in peace. It's a very affecting performance and is the most serious of the group. His delivery of the line, "That ain't right. I've had enough of what ain't right," is powerful. And with Kevin Costner, who is almost impossibly young as Jake, you've got the trigger-happy kid who doesn't take life too seriously. Kevin Costner is so much fun here and is a scene stealer from the first moment we meet him, using his jail cell like a jungle gym. These days, as he's become this older, gravelly-voiced guy, it's fun to look back on his character here. These 4 men all deliver wonderful performances, and they're given varying degrees of depth. Emmett and Jake are admittedly not terribly deep characters, with the biggest arc for Jake being when he doesn't grin or burst out laughing after gunning down his foes during the finale, which I believe was a bit of a disagreement between Costner and Lawrence Kasdan. But with Mal, you have a character that is forced to confront racism, which is shown in his first scene, and then more so implied later by the McKendrick henchmen. And there's the universal feeling of trying to defend your family and your land. His scene where he discovers his murdered father is Very emotional. And finally, with Payton, you have the most well-defined character of the movie. At first it seems he might be the comic relief, and quite often he is, but behind his unexpressive face, there's a man who is wrestling with who he is and what he should care about. This trajectory of the character is explored wonderfully throughout, going from a man who's willing to set out anything that might be dangerous unless it benefits him, to a man that will stick his neck out because it might impress a woman, until finally stepping up to take on corruption because it's the right thing to do. And Kevin Kline does all this with such subtlety. It's a hard choice to make, but Payton is probably my favorite character. And his polar opposite is Cobb, played by Brian Dennehy. Brian Dennehy could play villains so well, and his performance here is no exception. He's this hulking, loud, sneering bad guy, and most importantly, the type of man that Payton used to call a friend. The performance is broad and has very little subtlety, and that's why it works. If our heroes, especially Payton, had to go up against a sly, quietly menacing antagonist, I think the whole thing would have been a study in underplaying, other than Kevin Costner. But when there's this clear threat looming over them, and it's just a matter of time until they must take him and the other bad guys on, it gives the movie a defined, classical structure, even if it might have an inevitable conclusion. And if there was any doubt that this man is evil, we're given this shot of him walking away with the entire screen behind him engulfed in flames. Linda Hunt, as Stella, is at the same time the person that Payton feels he must protect, and also his conscience in a way. She can give voice to his feelings that he doesn't express, or draw out his thoughts in ways that no other character in the movie can. She is an unusual actress to appear in a Western, but she works very well. She's a fun, somewhat comforting character, and her final speech to Payton that pushes him back into the fight that he'd been avoiding is excellent. Elsewhere in the cast is John Cleese, as a hilariously deadpan British immigrant sheriff that our heroes run afoul of. His first line of the movie is a Monty Python reference, "What's all this then?" And it just gets better from there. Every moment with him is fantastic, and I've managed to work his line, "the dead one," into conversations throughout my life. We've also got Jeff Fahey and James Gammon as bad guys. Jeff Fahey, with his wide, staring eyes, is the most unpredictable and fearsome of the villains, only being held in check by Cobb. And James Gammon, while it's only a small role, is instantly memorable with his raspy, yelling voice. Joe Seneca is heartbreaking and superb as Mel's father, and on an entirely different note, Earl Hindman plays Emmett and Jake's brother-in-law. If you've ever wondered what Wilson from Home Improvement looked like from behind that fence, watch Silverado. And now we come to Jeff Goldblum and Rosanna Arquette, the two characters that are strange and not quite necessary additions to this movie. Rosanna Arquette plays a frontier widow that apparently both Emmett and Payton are supposed to be interested in. The love triangle aspect is barely there, and she doesn't really share any chemistry with either of them, so if there was something that needed to be cut, it would be her. But with Jeff Goldblum, you have a character that becomes entangled in the events of the film, but we're never quite sure why. Far be it from me to not want Jeff Goldblum in a Western, and with his gigantic fur coat, the knife hidden in his boot, and the derringer tucked up his sleeve, it seems like a character you just have to have. But in reality, he's just a gambler that shows up and just by osmosis is absorbed into the bad guy faction. We're never quite sure what he gains by any of this, although I'm sure it's money, and is perhaps waiting in the wings to take over Payton's job should Payton grow too large of a conscience for Cobb's sake, but it's unclear. I like him in the movie, but I've never been able to figure out why he's in it. Okay, that's the cast, or most of them, but let's be honest. If there's just one thing that sets this movie apart, it's the score. Bruce Broughton wrote one of the most instantly iconic scores in Western movie history. It's majestic, and the main theme is one of those pieces of music where I just marvel that a person dreamt this up. It accompanies so many scenes of characters riding, and I'm hard-pressed to think of many other scores that can beat it. The Magnificent Seven would be the other top contender for best main theme for a Western ever. And I'll just quickly mention those riding scenes. Those are the biggest example of this being a movie that is meant to be taken theatrically. This is by no means a movie that is meant to be taken as a historically accurate representation of life in the Wild West, because no four riders would ride in a perfectly straight line, four across, everywhere they go. They're riding that way because it looks amazing, and that's the only reason. Those scenes are shot beautifully, with the camera panning up across the horses' necks to take in these four very serious men, who I'm sure must all be thinking, we look pretty great, don't we? And the wide shots of them crossing the prairie, what more could you want? But it's not just in the main theme that Bruce Broughton really delivers. It's in the opening scene, that low, suspenseful score that leads into the main theme. or the magnificent track that accompanies the wagon train traveling towards Silverado, or that supremely satisfying song as Emmett and Mal prepare for the final battle. I could keep listing the moments that are elevated by Bruce Broughton's music, but just suffice it to say that each time the score comes in, it's perfect. It's a score that I listen to for fun, separate from the movie, and while I'm driving, especially when I'm driving. Although it does lend itself to not paying attention to the speedometer, so that's maybe not the best thing to recommend. And besides the music, the action and the gunplay is where this movie excels. Even if the character arcs aren't mind-blowing, or it's not the most thought-provoking plot, you can always count on the action to get your blood pumping and keep you hooked to the story. And what Lawrence Kasdan does so well is use action to demonstrate character. The way he brings the four men together, then splits them apart, and then finally brings them back together is the strength of this story. And action informs, explains, and punctuates every part of that. We meet Emmett being ambushed in a cabin, and the way in which he dispatches his attackers shows us the kind of marksman he is and his skill before we know anything else about him. We watch as Payton coolly and calmly retrieves his horse, his hat, and his gun. The way in which he takes down the man who stole his horse is perfect. He fires without flair and watches the man fall at his feet. Like the man we see him to be, he doesn't do things in a flashy way, just quickly and with as little effort as possible. Mal is pushed to the brink and takes down 3 men in a fistfight and leaves on his terms. And his first display of shooting ability, while keeping back John Cleese and his posse, shows his loyalty and kinship to men that have been mistreated as he has been. And with Jake, his constant gun twirling and indiscreet usage of his guns demonstrate that he likes to be seen and that he has a lot to learn. Putting him beside Payton for those early scenes is perfect to see the dichotomy between them. The sound design is so great, with the gunshots being deep and powerful, with different sound effects to differentiate between weapons, and the consistency in which recoil is shown. So many westerns, especially older westerns, show people firing guns, and they might as well be firing a BB gun. But here, in almost every case, when a gun is fired, you can almost feel it. The guns buck, and I'm guessing they were using full loads for their blanks. It's perhaps a small touch, but such a crucial one that gives the gunplay impact that so many movies, westerns or otherwise, can lack. There's some acrobatics to the action, but not to the point of unrealism or showing us something that takes us out of the movie. In particular, the battle at the McKendrick Ranch gives each of our heroes a chance to take on the bad guys with a little extra athleticism. Mal dives through the air, firing his Henry into that one guy with the eye patch. You gotta have a bad guy with an eye patch, right? Emmett launches himself through a window to rescue his nephew. Jake does some various stunts with a rope in the barn, whether it's swinging through the air or dropping down between 2 more henchmen. And even Payton gets in on it, rolling out from hiding to drop the last bad guy. And the finale gives them each their own confrontation, and they're played in order from least significant to most significant. Jake's is incredible as he takes down 2 bad guys at once while standing at the corner entrance of a saloon. Mal takes on Jeff Goldblum, or as his mother calls him, Slick, I guess killing him because he set him up and because he's far too friendly with Mal's sister. Emmett has a wonderful horse chase / running gun battle with Ethan McKendrick, the man who's been gunning for him since the first scene of the movie, and the fact that he kills him by jumping his horse right into his head is very satisfying, considering what was done to Emmett earlier in the film. And finally, Payton walks out into the street to take on Cobb in a classic fast-draw duel. It's filmed so well, those shots by their holsters are fantastic. Payton is standing with a bright white church behind him, literally representing the forces of good, while Cobb has only a desolate brown wasteland behind him. And the way Brian Dennehy falls when, spoiler alert, he's shot, is perfect. He looks like a massive tree hitting the ground. He just falls to his knees and topples over, nothing drawn out or gratuitous, and Payton simply puts his gun back in his holster, knowing that he's done the right thing. All of the action, I mean, all of it, every single beat is incredible. I didn't even mention the part where they retrieve the stolen money from the wagon train. Towards the end of the movie, the action is much more serious, but that whole sequence, filmed in this winding canyon, is fun from start to finish. It's the moment that cements these 4 into the team that they will become again by the end. And Scott Glenn gets his comedic time to shine as he fast-talks his way through meeting James Gammon and stares wide-eyed as Mal gets increasingly close with his near-miss rifle shots. The cinematography was by John Bailey, and the whole movie is gorgeous. It was shot in New Mexico. They built the whole town from scratch for this movie, and John Bailey films it wonderfully. This is again a tribute to the classic Western. The low lighting and drab interiors of something like Pale Rider, those have no place in Silverado. These scenes are warm, lighting-wise, even though it appears them all shot in pretty cold temperatures. The colors are bright, the use of light streaming through bullet holes in the opening scene, or when Cobb kills the man in the saloon, all of it is just a joy to watch. And the same goes for the costumes. Once again, probably not the most historically accurate, but who cares? Emmett's whole outfit with the brown leather chaps, Payton's layers of striped jackets and vests, and the string tie, Mal's scarf and duster, Jake's fringe shirt, the ornate two-gun rig, Cobb's costumes, first his weathered trail outfit when we meet him, and then his coats and much more expensive finery when he's the sheriff and saloon owner in Silverado, even Stella's dresses, Tyree's huge coat that he's almost drowning in. I've already mentioned Slick. Oh, and Payton's first hat before he recovers the one he spent years training. I'm pretty sure that's supposed to look like John Wayne's hat last seen in Rio Bravo. The costumes were by Christy Z, and she deserves all the credit in the world. Some westerns love to dive headlong into the muted browns, blacks, and grays that are perhaps more accurate, but let's face it, it's not as fun. The cowboys from Tombstone might have informed the western reenactor scene the most in the long term, and I enjoy those as well, but Silverado still tops them to me. Knowing that Lawrence Kasdan loves westerns, I'm sure there were plenty of little references he wanted to include that would evoke imagery or scenes from westerns past, but I'll highlight just one. When Emmett finally drags himself from his bed and learns that his nephew has been kidnapped and his sister and brother-in-law have been attacked, he slowly and painfully straps on a gun belt. If you go back to The Far Country, the Anthony Mann, Jimmy Stewart Western from 1954, there is a very similar scene as Jimmy Stewart prepares for battle after the murder of Walter Brennan's character. The Far Country is another favorite of mine, and the two scenes are far too similar to just be a coincidence. Something that my dad and I have discussed is, had Silverado been made during the heyday of westerns, which it could have and fit in perfectly well with the movies of that earlier era, who would have starred in it? I've thought about this quite a bit, and the era I'm going to say it could have been made would be the late 50s, early 60s. For Emmett, he could easily be played by either John Wayne or Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper, especially a young Gary Cooper, could have carried off scenes like the one in the canyon with ease, but he would likely have seemed a little old in this made-up scenario I'm going with. So I'll just have to say John Wayne. John Wayne could play the comedy so well, and obviously the action. The scene where Emmett is attacked during his target practice, I'm picturing John Wayne being left for dead in Hondo. For Jake, you're looking for a smaller guy and an energetic and athletic actor, and one with a somewhat reckless sense of humor. So I'd have to say Kirk Douglas. He and John Wayne had good chemistry in the movies they made together, so they do well together here. Yes, they'd be playing brothers, which seems odd, but Dean Martin played a younger brother to the Duke at one point too. For Payton, I think there's only one option for the quiet, conflicted man with a sense of humor who decides to do what's right in the end. Henry Fonda. Especially for that era, you look at something like Warlock, he'd have the perfect look and demeanor. And for Mal, there's unfortunately not a huge variety of black actors to choose from in that era, but the one I'm thinking of would have been perfect. Woody Strode. He made The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance with John Wayne, and while he wasn't a man of action in that one, if you look at something like The Professionals, you know he could pull this off too. If you have ideas for your own lineup of heroes that could populate a classic-era Silverado, let me know in the comments. It's fun to me, since Silverado is such an old-fashioned movie as it is, and I can definitely see these older, iconic actors in the roles. But back to the movie we actually have. If you've seen it before, I hope you love it as much as I do. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. It's a story of friendship, told beautifully, with epic visuals and a cast of up-and-coming actors who coalesce into this wonderful group of characters. And before I sign off, let me just leave you with these few quotes that will hopefully encourage you to revisit this movie, and soon. Now I don't want to kill you and you don't want to be dead. This ought to do. Today my jurisdiction ends here. Thanks very much for watching, and adios for now.